Are you listening? Damn. Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to our notes on the Progressive Era, a time period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when there were a lot of problems with society in the United States, and people tried to fix those problems in a variety of ways. And in this cartoon, in this political cartoon, we see Theodore Roosevelt in the background here watching as one of his cabinet members put the screws, a medieval form of torture, put the screws on the trusts. If you remember from earlier lessons, trusts is another name for monopolies, and we see the monopolies getting squeezed here and all the money falling out of the monopolies' pockets. Theodore Roosevelt was called a Trustbuster, and that was one of his goals, to break up monopolies and to more evenly distribute the money in society. And so that's why it's the background for our notes today. It is designed to show you that trusts were just one of the major problems that the United States faced and had to fix. And that's, again, the Progressive Era from the 1890s to the 1920s. Trying to change the status quo. The status quo is what is normal and what is accepted. And for many people in this time period, the status quo was unacceptable.
Dang blasted! What's going on?
So what was the Progressive Movement? At the turn of the 20th century, there were bad conditions in politics, industry, and these brought about efforts for reform. These efforts became known as the Progressive Movement, which would try to bring government under the control of the people, restore economic prosperity for all, and correct injustices in American life. There are 4 goals to the movement. Before we talk about those 4 goals, let's just look at this political cartoon here. And we see the trusts, all the trusts, monopolies, they're pirates. They're taking over the ship. The ship represents the United States. They're pulling down the United States flag and walking all over it, and they're making Uncle Sam walk the plank. And if you can see the caption in the bottom here, it says, "One sees his finish unless good government retakes the ship." So the government had to take more control over the country and stop these monopolists, these trusts from controlling everything. And the trust, of course, would be headed by people like the Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller or Vanderbilt in different areas of industry. So what were these 4 goals? Well, protecting social welfare, making sure that people's lives were better, just overall better, and not living hand to mouth and just in survival mode all the time. Another goal, promoting moral improvement, trying to get people to live better lives, not drink so much, not be so violent, treat people nicely. Creating economic reform, like we saw in the cartoon there, the trust-busting of Roosevelt, trying to make the monopolists share more money. And fostering efficiency, trying to get tasks done more quickly, but also more accurately.
Hey, bacteria brain! Come down and let's discuss your future as a mental patient!
Okay, so our theme for the sounds today is 1980s cartoon shows, because I grew up in the 80s. Anyway, the Industrial Revolution had made life difficult for city dwellers. They had to deal with pollution, bad sanitation, and bad housing, among other things. And the settlement house movement inspired people to fix these problems. We have different organizations formed to try to help people in bad areas of the cities, like the slum areas or the tenements. The Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, the Salvation Army would form and help by opening libraries and creating soup kitchens and providing education to the poor working class people of the inner cities of the slums. Here's the symbols of both the YMCA and the Salvation Army here. Still around today, of course. Child labor in these states would take a hit with the Keating-Owen Act of 1916, which banned the transportation of goods made by children across state lines. The Supreme Court outlawed it, but states would pass their own laws. And again, here's a picture. I believe this is a Lewis Hine picture of child labor in a textile mill. Reformers would also succeed in gaining a 10-hour workday for men, reducing the work hours for women. They also gained workers' compensation for injury or death. And these are things that we would imagine would be common in the workplace today. You would have these things when you sign on. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were not common. And hours would run much longer for people. And there was no such thing as workers' compensation.
Thunder! Thunder! Thundercats!
Thundercats. Okay. Promoting moral improvement. Many thought that the quality of life would improve when people improved the way they acted. The morality of the U.S. would have to change. Morals are the rules, you live by. And for many, improving morals meant an end to drinking, and this period would be known as Prohibition. One group which was instrumental in bringing about Prohibition, a driving force, would be the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Actually, it was founded in Cleveland, Ohio, and women in WCTU would do anything to stop people from drinking, including going into bars and breaking liquor bottles. And that brings us to our first video in this notes. This is about Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation. In 1881, Kansas became the first state to outlaw booze. Teetotaler Carrie Nation takes to entering saloons with a hatchet to destroy bottles of liquor. She occasionally greets bartenders with a cheery, "Good morning, destroyer of men's souls." And now we're going to watch a small excerpt from a larger documentary by Ken Burns, all about Prohibition. And this small excerpt is just about Carrie Nation.
Kansas had already banned the sale of alcohol in every one of its 105 counties. But the state's dusty cow towns and large cities alike were filled with thirsty men, and no one paid much attention to the law. As president of the Barber County WCTU, Carrie Nation had led peaceful marches that had had little effect, wrote letters to legislators and lawmen that were never even answered, and eventually became convinced God wished her to do more.
On the 6th of June, 1900, before retiring, I threw myself downward at the foot of my bed and told the Lord to use me in any way to suppress the dreadful curse of liquor. I told him I wished I had 1,000 lives, that I would give him all of them. And I wanted him to make it known to me some way. The next morning, before I awoke, I heard these words very distinctly. "Go to Kiowa, and I'll stand by you."
The next morning, with an armload of what she called smashers, rocks and bottles wrapped in paper to look like harmless packages, she strode into a saloon in Kiowa.
I told the owner, Mr. Dobson, "Get out of the way. I don't want to strike you, but I'm going to break up this den of vice." I began to throw at the mirror and the bottles below the mirror. Mr. Dobson and his companion jumped into a corner, seemed very much terrified. From that, I went to another saloon until I had destroyed 3. The other dive keepers closed up, stood in front of their places, and would not let me in. By this time, the streets were crowded with people. One boy, about 15 years old, seemed perfectly wild with joy. I have since thought of that being a significant sign, for to smash saloons will save the boy.
She dared the sheriff to arrest her. He did not. She moved on to Wichita to attack the most opulent saloon in town, the bar in the Hotel Carrie. When a policeman arrested her there for defacing property, She shouted at him, "I am defacing nothing. I am destroying." "You put me in here a cub," she said from behind bars, "but I will go out a roaring lion, and I will make all hell howl." Her exploits were front-page news. Hundreds of congratulatory telegrams arrived from all over the country. As soon as she got out, she attacked another saloon, this time with the weapon that would become her symbol, a hatchet. Jailed and released once more, she moved on to the town of Enterprise, did further damage there, and then appeared in Topeka, the state capital, and home to dozens of flourishing saloons, all of them illegal. The leaders of the Topeka WCTU declared themselves not in accord with her methods. "I tell you, ladies," she answered, "you don't know how much joy you will have until you begin to smash, smash, smash." The governor implored her not to do any more damage. She told him that if he didn't enforce the law, she had no choice. "You are a woman," he said, "and a woman must know a woman's place." She walked out of his office and called for a hatchetation. Many Kansans believed Nation was at least half mad, but hundreds of women and a smaller number of men rallied to her, bringing their own stones and bricks, sticks and hatchets, and calling themselves the Home Defenders Army. Proprietors of the local saloons tried and failed to stop them. She and her followers tore apart a joint favored by state legislators called the Senate, then went on to smash a second bar, a barn filled with saloon fixtures, and a warehouse stacked high with barrels of beer. That day, Carrie Nation was jailed and released 4 times. Within the month, her admirers would attack more than 100 saloons in at least 50 Kansas towns. Anxious state legislators rushed through a bill to strengthen enforcement of the law and pacify her and her Home Defenders Army. It was a remarkable victory. Carrie Nation hoped her movement would spread across the country and sweep away all of the nation's saloons. But once again, like the Woman's Crusade, it died almost as quickly as it had arisen. Carrie Nation never stopped crusading, in saloons and churches, lecture halls, even on the vaudeville stage. For many, she became a figure of fun, even ridicule. But so long as she lived, bartenders never stopped keeping a wary eye out for her and her dreaded hatchet.
And so I hope you enjoyed that little video about Carrie Nation. Definitely one of the proponents of Prohibition and banning alcohol. And again, she and her compatriots were successful. But when we come to the 1920s and we look at that time period, we'll see that Prohibition itself was not successful. And so although they did officially get alcohol banned, the process of banning alcohol was not as easy and foolproof as they would have hoped. And now we're going to talk about creating economic reform. Many economic reforms would occur during the Progressive Era, and these would include the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. This created the FTC. The FTC would be a watchdog over corporations to make sure they weren't violating regulations. We have the Underwood Act of 1913, which would reduce tariffs in the U.S. Tariffs are taxes on foreign goods, trying to make sure that trade and commerce would flow more easily across borders with other countries. Then we have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, divided the nation into 12 banking districts, and established a regional central bank in each district to serve all the surrounding banks. And this system still serves our nation today. The Federal Reserve is very important when it comes to setting interest rates for loans. Here you can see a map of the Federal Reserve districts. And you can see here in Zanesville, we are part of District 4, and the headquarters for District 4 are in Cleveland itself. And so you can actually see, if you look at a dollar bill, dollar bills have letters on them, A, B, C, D, E, etc. And each letter, corresponds to a different numbered banking district. So like a dollar bill coming from Boston would have an A on it because that's first. And then like one from Cleveland would have a D on it. Just kind of a little bit of tidbit information there. Then we finally have the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, and this strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Made it, remember, antitrust means anti-monopoly, and this act made it illegal for companies to acquire stock if it meant the creation of a monopoly. So it was difficult for one company to buy out another company's stock if it was going to become a monopoly. It also made strikes, peaceful picketing, and boycotts officially legal. So these methods of protest could now be carried out. Here's just a little picture showing the Clayton Antitrust Act. It's kind of like the cop. The enforcer here, it's carrying a cop's baton. It says Clayton Antitrust Law, and looking at it as a dishonest trust, a dishonest monopoly. Should I buy out the stock of another company, or the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to wail on me if I do?
They keep going and going.
In 1980s cartoon, that was a 1980s commercial about the Energizer Bunny. Progressives would call for greater efficiency in many areas of society. In the legal world, lawyer Louis Brandeis' method of arguing, called the Brandeis Brief, would focus court arguments on the advice of experts. Here's a picture of Louis Brandeis. And this would be very important because before that, court trials were focused on things like witness testimony and things like that. Expert testimony wasn't necessarily considered, but with expert testimony, you could bring in science into a court proceeding, like the expert of a psychologist in criminal forensics or something like that. And it became something we use very often today. We bring lawyers will bring in an expert to testify at trial. In industry, scientific management would be used to determine just how quickly industrial tasks could be performed. Time is money, and tasks could be performed quickly and accurately. That would save a company money.
My name is Optimus Prime. We are autonomous robotic organisms from the planet Cybertron, but you can call us Autobots for short.
That's from the Transformers movie a few years back. It's still kind of old. Anyway. Several election reforms. Another thing, election reforms and constitutional amendments. Several election reforms would be adopted at the state level. These included the secret ballot, the Australian ballot. People can't find out who you voted for, so they can't extort money from you or put pressure on you to vote one way or another. So the ballot would be secret. An initiative, a law which would be initiated by people instead of lawmakers. A referendum, a vote on the initiative, and the recall vote, which allowed voters to recall corrupt public officials. Also, the primary system allowed voters to choose the candidates for the general elections instead of the party bosses. So, we have primaries, Republican primaries, Democratic primaries, to choose the candidate for each party that's going to run in the election. And then we have these constitutional amendments of the Progressive Era, which are important, and you need to remember these and commit them to memory for future tests. First of all, we have the 16th Amendment in 1913. Congress could levy an income tax. All right, so you don't like the IRS, you don't like income tax, well, you can thank the 16th Amendment. But of course, on the other hand, people don't like to pay taxes, but taxes do fund any number of public services which we need. 17th Amendment in 1913, direct election of U.S. senators. Sorry, that's a little bit ahead, but direct election of U.S. senators. U.S. senators, we have 2 per state, and so we have 100 U.S. senators right now because we have 50 states. The direct election of U.S. senators would mean the people in each state choose their senators, not the state legislatures. Then we have the 18th Amendment in 1919, the prohibition of alcoholic beverages, which we just learned about with Carrie Nation and their WCTU and their successful passage of the 18th Amendment would lead us to the era of prohibition in the 1920s. And then the 19th Amendment in 1920 was women's suffrage, giving women the right to vote. Those 4 amendments are the Progressive Era amendments.
Time to make the donuts.
Another part of the Progressive Era was making life better for women. Women had many problems in the Progressive Era. By 1870, 70% of all women were working women were house servants. And this was not a surprise, as very few had access to higher education. We're not talking about high school, well, we're not talking about college, but we're also talking about high school. Women didn't necessarily go to school. Very few women had a college education. Many labor unions refused to allow women entry, and women were continually denied the right to vote up until the 19th Amendment. Here's some pictures of house servants, and you can see out of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 house servants there, only 2 are men. Reform-minded women would try to change this by forming groups to fight for their rights. And these groups included the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, formed in 1896. It strove to improve the moral quality of blacks. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed in 1890 and was led by such women progressives as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they would fight to bring the right to vote or suffrage to women. On the left, you can see Susan B. Anthony. On the right is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Again, 2 suffragettes. And colleges would form all-girls schools to provide women a chance for higher education. For example, Harvard would create the all-girls school Radcliffe. Brown University would create Pembroke, and Columbia University would create Barnard. And you can notice these are all, Ivy League schools. That's where this tradition of co-educational education would start. Of course, Ohio has its own history with this, with Oberlin College.
Pardon me, would you have any Grey Poupon?
Let's look at progressivism under some of the presidents now. We got Theodore Roosevelt. The first progressive president was Theodore Roosevelt. 1901 to 1909, he would gain office when William McKinley was assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt says to break up the government trusts. Again, his nickname was the Trustbuster. And we'll talk about that in a second. TR's domestic programs would be called the Square Deal, as they would give the common man a fair chance to make a living. One way TR would try to help the common man was by breaking up monopolies, which he believed to be abusing the public. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act. To do this, he got the nickname the Trustbuster. Here's a picture of him swinging his club against all the evil tycoons and monopolies. Big oil, big steel, big coal. T. Roosevelt says, "Bully, it's a capital present for my birthday. Fat cats, oh, thrash us no longer, mad bull moose." So yeah, the club, speak softly but carry a big stick. Though his support of the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and through his support of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, TR would make the products people bought safer. And these actions were inspired by muckraker Upton Sinclair in his book, The Jungle, which we did a focus question about earlier in this unit. And here's a picture of a young Upton Sinclair in his book, The Jungle. Of course, his book was all about the meatpacking industry and how it abused its workers, but people who read the book didn't care so much about the abuse the workers were undergoing. They cared about what was going into their food and how their food was being made. And Roosevelt got the ball rolling after he read this book. He wanted these laws passed so that people would have safer food. And of course, we have the FDA today. The Pure Food and Drug Act created the FDA. Finally, Theodore Roosevelt was very famous for his conservation. Now, we think of Roosevelt as being a hunter and an outdoorsman, and he was, but he also wanted to conserve nature. He wanted to preserve it for people coming down the line. Conservation had largely been ignored in the United States before Theodore Roosevelt, influenced by naturalist John Muir, changed this. He would set aside 148 million acres of forest to be preserved for development. He would also establish 50 wildlife preserves and 7 national parks. I'm going to talk about William Howard Taft. But before we do that, I want to show you a short video all about Theodore Roosevelt. It's from an old cartoon from the 1990s called Hysteria, and it talks about Roosevelt being a trustbuster, which Taft was to some extent too, but anyway, we'll talk about Taft in a little bit.
Extra, extra! Read all about it! Teddy Roosevelt uses Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies!
At the turn of the 20th century, rival companies merged to become huge corporations called monopolies, or trusts. They took over industries such as oil, sugar, and even matches.
Kelba mirror.
Would you mind running that by us again in English?
It means, what a bummer!
No, what the time dude said.
He said some companies got so big that little companies couldn't compete with them.
Oh.
And that's not good.
Right. These trusts worried people. So Teddy Roosevelt started breaking up the big companies and earned himself the nickname Trustbuster.
If something stinks in the business world, give a shout.
Trustbuster.
If monopolies make you wanna hurl, give him a shout.
Trustbuster. I'm gonna bust me a trust.
If corporate greed gets way too big, give him a shout. Trustbuster. When robber barons act like greedy pigs, give him a shout. Trustbuster.
I'm gonna bust me a trust.
Give him a shout.
Trustbuster.
If JP Morgan makes a sneaky bargain, give him a shout. Trustbuster.
I'm gonna bust me a trust.
Rockefeller's corner the market. Give him a shout.
Trustbuster.
If you've beaten the dust of a powerful trust, you'd better shout. Trustbuster.
Oh, let me tell you something. Trustbuster makes me feel good.
So if you want the man who'll do all he can, you know you gotta shout. Trustbuster. Ow! Give him a shout. Trustbuster. Give him a shout. Trustbuster. Give him a shout. Trustbuster. Give him a shout. Trustbuster.
And there you go. There's a short video from the old cartoon show Hysteria. It's in the same vein as Animaniacs. Animaniacs has recently been rebooted for the 2020s. It's an old Steven Spielberg project, and that was set to the old Ghostbusters movie theme. Roosevelt again was the Trustbuster, but William Howard Taft actually tried to break up more monopolies than he did. The second progressive president was William Howard Taft from Ohio, 1909-1913. He was handpicked by Theodore Roosevelt, TR, to be his successor, but he would be cautious in his reforms. Despite this cautious nature, Taft would still initiate 90 antitrust suits against monopolies. Taft, unfortunately, has the reputation of being the most rotund president, and the legend around him is that he got stuck in the White House bathtub, and a special bathtub had to be made for him so he could fit in. You can look up information about that on your own, but again, a little bit of tidbit about history there. He angered many Republicans, though, because he refused to lower tariffs, and did not seem to care much for the environment. Republicans at that time period, they wanted lower tariffs, more environmental regulations, kind of a flip-flop from what we might consider Republicans today, who may be on higher tariffs and less environmental regulations. The Republican Party would be split for the presidential election of 1912. Even though most Republicans supported TR, the party's leaders would maneuver Republicans to nominate Taft as their candidate. TR and the Progressives would revolt and form their own party, the Bull Moose Party. So the Republicans broke apart in the election of 1912. Roosevelt wanted Taft to stand down, and he wanted to be president again. Taft said no. The official Republican stance was, hey, we're going to stick with Taft. Roosevelt can go pound salt. Roosevelt said, fine, you want to do that? I want to start my own party. You got the Democrats as the donkeys. You got the Republicans as the elephants. Well, I'm going to be the Bull Moose Party. But with the Republicans split down the middle, a lot of Republicans supported Taft, a lot of Republicans supported Roosevelt. But dividing their vote let the Democrats win. Democrats would win the election, and Woodrow Wilson would become the last
Where's the beef?
of the progressive presidents. And so let's finish up here with Woodrow Wilson. He was the third progressive president, 1913 to 1921. He's the former governor of New Jersey and received a strict Presbyterian upbringing. Also the president of Princeton, the Ivy League university. His moral upbringing influenced him to provide the country with a new freedom from the abuses of trust, tariffs, and high finances. Here is, again, a picture of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson oversaw the initiation of numerous economic and social reforms, but he didn't succeed in everything. He failed to address civil rights. He turned a blind eye to lynching in the South. He allowed segregation to begin again in Washington, D.C. We have things going on during his administration, which are very terrible for blacks and minorities in the country, and he doesn't really try to stop it at all. And this offended W.E.B. Du Bois. We talked about Du Bois before. Harvard-educated black author and sociologist. And Du Bois had supported Wilson's election and felt very betrayed by Woodrow Wilson afterward. And Woodrow Wilson would not receive his support again. Had events allowed him to do so, Wilson probably would have continued with his reforms into the second term. But international events in World War I would draw his attention away from progressivism. World War I would essentially mark the end of progressivism, this era of progressivism in the United States. The end of the progressive movement led to the start of U.S. involvement in World War I, and we'll be talking about that when we talk about U.S. imperialism and our involvement in the First World War. That's all for now. Make sure that you are finishing your notes in relation to this unit, and if you have any questions, you know where to reach me. Thanks, guys. Miller out.
Yeah.